I came across a reference to a technique that Masters and Johnson essentially, they were the first to document the whole sexual response cycle from arousal through orgasm, and they wanted to document like what happens in the human body, male and female, and with women, a lot of that's going on inside. So they're like, well, we got to figure out a way to see what's going on. They actually built a penis camera in essence, and women would come into their lab and essentially have sex with this penis camera, which would document their responses from the inside. And I just remember thinking, sex research, next book, just because that is such a, a technological challenge or logistical, ethical, weird challenge to how, to figure out how do you study something like that in a scientific setting. So that was actually just a reference in Film Quarterly, of all places, to the colposcopic films of Masters and Johnson. I remember going, colposcopic, that means like cervical, what, huh? And looking it up and doing a little research and finding out about that whole project, which is, and this was the 1950s too, which is incredible that they were, finding people who would come into a lab and be willing to be documented in that way. So that's what got me rolling. Viagra is it affects the vascular system. So they were very eager to test that out on women, hoping that they could, sell a drug to the other half of the planet. And it doesn't work. It does actually increase genital blood flow in women, but it doesn't create a change that the women then interpret as, I'm really aroused, I want to have sex, I feel really sexy. It doesn't do that. They don't even notice. It's a small enough change that it's not something that they would pay for. It's not really doing anything. So they then looked at, well, there's the other approach to libido in women is hormonal, and there actually is a patch, testosterone patch, which was all set to go, called Intrinsa, and the FDA then wanted longer-term safety data, I think because of hormone replacement therapy. Remember that there was that big, we thought that hormone replacement therapy was the next greatest thing since whatever, sliced bread. Then they came up with this long-term findings, or saying that they were actually increasing risk of stroke, and then there was that big study that scared everyone off. So the FDA kind of backed off hormones. So now the only thing left is central nervous system. Look at affecting the brain, and I think that that's going to be tricky, because I think that the FDA considers sex a lifestyle issue, not really a medical issue. So in order to pass something for what is considered, to get a drug approved for something that's considered a lifestyle issue, they're going to be pretty squeamish about affecting your brain for that purpose. So they may have maybe a bit of a long road to get something approved. For the most part, it's the placebo effect. One researcher told me about, she actually took bought a few of these just to see what was going on, and there was one for women, and she said it had in it sort of like a topical, almost like a capsaicin, like a red hot pepper substance, and she said, so it did generate a little heat, but she said in the directions there was this line that says, apply to vulva, rub really well, rub really, really, really well. And they're like, so yeah, people go, hey, wow, this really works. So my sense is that there's not, other than the placebo effect, and I don't mean to knock the placebo effect, because it's really, it works. You tell somebody something works and they make it work. And if it works, it works. I don't care how it works. So I don't want to dismiss everything. I don't want to tell people, don't even try it, because if it's harmless and it's a harmless placebo and it works, then more power to it. But I don't know, the safety of, I wouldn't feel comfortable purchasing a drug online from a supplier that I didn't know. I don't know. What are they're coming out of China, a lot of these things. I was in Taiwan with a researcher, and he took me to a traditional pharmacy, and there's just, the guy kept coming out from the back with these boxes. It was like the shoe salesman guy when I was young, with this big stack of boxes. Here would be old dinosaur bones, and that was supposed to be, and the researcher would go, just because they're hard, and anything shaped like a penis, that was a treatment for erectile dysfunction. Just one after another, bringing out all of these herbal and other sort of natural things from the natural world that were supposedly cures for. But as for something being things that work, well, testosterone, small amounts of testosterone for women are pretty reliably effective, and you don't have to, the patch, which is sold in Europe, isn't sold here, but you can go to any compounder and say, look, or just get a prescription from your physician saying, I want a very low dose of testosterone for libido. And doctors prescribe that all the time, and it's fairly effective from what I understand. But outside of that, I think it's, again, a question of if you think it'll work, maybe it'll work. So give it a try. I think what was interesting to me is just the split in this country. I think, I frequently get questions often, from Europeans. Are Americans seem so prudish, and when it comes to sex, I'm like, wait. Which Americans are you talking about? Red state or blue state? Urban or rural? Because we have nothing in common. And that holds true for sex, I think. Although, there are some conservative religious groups that are very pro-sex. I interviewed a guy who, he had this product. It was basically vaginal weightlifting, and it was to strengthen the Kegel muscles. And it's this, looks like sort of a two-sided doorknob, and you would insert it and kind of squeeze it and pull it up and down. And I was interviewing this guy, and as it turns out, he's a Christian. It's a Christian company. They had this sort of Christian symbol, and I said to him, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And he said, why? And I said, well, I don't really associate sexual pleasure with Christians. I'm sorry, that sounds really ridiculous, but conservative Christians. And he said, no, sexuality is a gift that God wants us to enjoy. And the guy was so open. He was talking about, well, men can Kegel too. You just hang a washcloth off it and lift. And I'm like, looking at the logo on the screen, which is sort of this flowing water. And it was just, anyway, so you have to be careful when you make these assumptions about religious conservatives and sexuality. But anyway, as a general statement, there is a real schism. There's a split in this country, and it seems to have both sides of it have gone further. I mean, they've gone further apart. You know what I mean? Like there seems to be more and more openness and tolerance in the urban and liberal community, and less in the other side of the fence. So that's really just. I again, because I was looking at the physiology, I didn't really focus too much on cultural issues. The most cutting edge work, there's a really great lab, University of Texas at Austin. That's a great lab. There's good stuff being done. So much of it now is testing drugs, and that's going on. That's really where the cutting edge is. I wasn't as interested in that, because from my perspective as a writer and researcher, it's boring. It's somebody taking a pill and writing a journal about whether they felt horny on Tuesday as opposed to Monday or whatever. So there's just very little of it going on outside of the pharmaceutical area, which was sad to me, because the stuff that I was focused on and I was so interested in was the explorations of sex just for the sake of figuring it out and understanding it. Like there was this guy, Roy Levin, who's now retired. He's a UK sexologist, and he was doing the stuff. He's the kind of scientist who'd think, all right, so homosexual, like anal sex, the prostate, what role does it play? What does the prostate, what's going on there? So he was, he wanted to, it was retiring, so he never did get around to doing that, but that kind of stuff where you're willing to say, I'm curious, nobody's studied this, let's just do it. That kind of work was, those guys are all retiring or they've died. There's so few of them out there. Giles Brindley was another one. The British did a lot of that pioneering work, and Masters and Johnson, of course. And in the 1950s, that was extraordinary what they were doing at the time that they were doing it. So the big names are kind of, we've entered an era of lots of people doing a little bit less exciting work, Well, pornography does, because when you're studying human sexual arousal in a laboratory setting, the most efficient and cheapest way to achieve it is to show pornography, although it isn't called pornography. It's called visual erotic stimulation, VES. So, but that makes it difficult for a researcher. Sometimes when they're submitting their grant proposal and they mention, any sort of erotic imagery, and it turns out that what they're doing is showing pornographic clips, then the people, the universities get a little skittish and people start asking questions. And, I did encounter researchers who were turned down, or the universities sort of called them aside and said, look, what's going on here? Because they thought there was some sort of weird voyeuristic thing going on. And anyway, I don't know if that was really what you were getting at with pornography, but pornography, it was funny. I asked one of the researchers, because I was a subject in one of these studies, and they had this clip. It was this rather, pornography is pretty badly edited anyway, but this is really like they're trying to get every possible kind of like penetration and oral and anal, everything in this clip. So they just sort of spliced a bunch from different movies, and then it follows the neutral stimulus, which is, a plane taking off or a ship in a harbor. It was the most surreal thing to be sitting there watching it. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with this, but, and I said to the researcher, well, is there a special company that you order these films, these film clips for? Because it's, scientific research. You can't just order them. Can't go down to the local porn shop. And they said, are you nuts? Of course we do. We go down. That's where we get them. And then we turn in our expenses and get reimbursed. And the other thing that's happening with pornography that is, I was just actually interviewing a pornographer this is for something entirely different, in Spain. And over in Europe now, the pornography producers are very much connected with the telephone companies, because it's all coming in on cell phones and iPhones and things, and it's little tiny clips. It's totally changed the industry. They're now not doing whole movies with, known stars. It's just, 3-minute shots of sexual, there's no plot. So the industry's totally different. And the amazing thing was that the telephone companies in Europe, not here, but it hasn't started happening here. Telephone companies are a little wary of censure from conservative groups, but it's really changed in Europe, and certainly would make it easier for the scientists who are doing arousal studies, because just download ABCD and you've got your 4 little clips. Well, what's going on now? Sex research today we're in a phase where it has a lot of the funding is going toward finding pharmaceutical solutions to sexual dysfunction. Sex research, in the 50s, when it really got going, 50s, 60s, 70s was sort of the heyday of bringing people into the lab and for the first time figuring out what happens when someone's aroused, what is orgasm, what the heck's going on. So a lot of that stuff has been done. So there are some pockets of it still going on, which I assiduously sought out and visited. But the bulk of the research today is moving toward testing drugs for coming up with products that will then, make somebody very wealthy. There was Viagra, and now the holy grail is finding something for low libido in postmenopausal women. That's kind of where a lot of the work is. But so sex research went from the Masters and Johnson era, then moved into when AIDS hit the scene. A lot of the money went toward, transmission of AIDS, risk-taking behavior, getting a handle on that, and then since then has moved towards this, dysfunction, helping people who have sexual dysfunction and looking at solutions, not just pharmaceutical, but other approaches. Someone was looking into the statistic. There's a statistic out there that 70% of women don't have orgasm from sexual intercourse alone. Now that right there is problematic, because when you say sexual intercourse, are you talking about, is the foreplay involved? Are you just talking, what was there, like a sensual massage? Were you watching porn beforehand? Right there it's problematic, that statistic. But there was a researcher who was looking at, why is that figure so low, and what makes the difference between the 70% who don't and the 30% who do? And he was looking at the distance between the clitoris and the vagina, which I thought was interesting work, and trying to see, is there a correlation? And there does seem to be a correlation. So that kind of basic anatomical, not basic, but that sort of anatomical, physiological exploration I'd like to see more of that going on. I understand why people don't do those studies. They tend to make your colleagues sort of raise their eyebrows, and it's sometimes hard to get subjects for them. But that's that kind of work. And then another area was the role of female orgasm in conception, in fertility. And there's this whole theory, it's called upsuck, around the turn of the last century. It was very commonly believed that the contractions of orgasm would sort of pull the semen up through the cervix and rapidly deliver it, and therefore you were more likely to conceive. And even going way back to Hippocrates, physicians used to counsel men, like, it's very important, you must titillate your wife prior to intercourse because her pleasure is necessary for conception. I mean, now we know it isn't necessary, but does it play a role? There are arguments on both sides of that, and that's a really interesting area. I'd love to see more people. There is actually a researcher who is doing some work in that area. So that kind of work I find fascinating. There's premature ejaculation. People are familiar with that, but then there's actually something called, well, it used to be called retarded ejaculation, but I think that sounded wrong. So now I think it's delayed ejaculation. So there's all these. Male sexual dysfunction tends to just, like, if it's not erectile, it's like that's all there is. But there's a whole kind of array of erectile difficulties that are interesting, because some people will say, like, premature ejaculation is one where there's been papers written. It's like, why is this a disorder? This actually evolved as a way. In the animal kingdom, the quicker you're done and the quicker you leave, the less likely are you to get attacked by a competing male. So it was actually evolutionarily advantageous to be a speedy ejaculator. And now it's being called a syndrome or a dysfunction. So there's all this debate, in the sexual research communities about that. That was sort of interesting. There's one in women. Persistent sexual arousal disorder, which is just this constant sense of being very aroused and not able to kind of conclude, or not able to get relief, and that people make jokes about, oh, I wish I had that, but it's actually a very troubling condition. There are all kinds of interesting orgasmic disorders that people don't know about. There are spontaneous orgasm. We're talking 30 times a day. There was a case study of a woman somewhere in the Middle East who, destroyed her social life. They made a note that she could no longer go to shrines and practice religious rituals. I mean, it would just be, your life would be sort of destroyed by something that the rest of us, orgasm. It's a lovely thing, but you can have too much of anything. So there's interesting sort of wiring problems that people wear. Like, there was a man who every time he defecated, he would have an orgasm. I think what happens is it tends to spiral one way or the other. I think that, in a conservative administration, people sort of they have a sense that this is going to be a Pandora's box. I don't want to. My life will be easier if I don't do this study. Why don't I just take a big grant for a fertility study? Everybody can get behind fertility and improving fertility. So I'll do that to get the money I need, and then I'll sort of on the side do a little bit of this other very interesting work. But I think that when you do have a sense that there is a more open-minded political element out there, that there'll be a little bit more of, people will feel a little safer and a little more encouraged, hopefully. But again, funding is so far down in all of the sciences, and it's so competitive that just to survive, just to get by, people are doing work that they don't have to wonder, are they going to be funded next year, or how will they pay for it? I was surprised with alarming frequency. I didn't know that women have nocturnal erections. That was a surprise to me. The whole clitoris as tiny penis, penis as huge clitoris for our feminists in the audience. Apparently, the erectile chambers, a little foreskin, little tiny smegma. I mean, it's just a little analog, which I guess I knew, but didn't really realize the extent of it, and the fact that women on the same sort of cycle as men have these little erections. That was interesting. Male multiple orgasm. Didn't realize that it was as common as it is. Not that it's common, but it's not terribly uncommon. That was interesting to me. And I guess also, surprised. A lot of times the surprise was that somebody actually studied that. The female erection studies. Somebody actually got a little tiny strain gauge and attached it to a clitoris, and a bunch of women, and actually went to the trouble of doing a well-controlled scientific study of that. And you gotta love science. That people are actually, inquiring minds want to know. Fetishes. I did talk to a researcher who got interested. Fetishes are something like 10 times more prevalent in males than in females. And somebody did actually tried, this was at UT Austin, tried to create a fetish by showing sexually stimulating images while the voice of the head of the psychology department was playing in the background. So it was like, I think it was sort of an in-joke on campus. They wanted to get the students all sexually aroused by the voice of the head of the chairman. So they tried. They did a study with like pictures of boots and shoes, and they were, yes, able to create an arousal response to a boot. You can create fetishes pretty easily. It's much easier with men than with women for some reason. Anyway, but they tried to get, it was just like, hello, welcome to the psychology department, of this guy's voice. And they tried very hard to get this situation where all the students would follow him around, just sort of moonily. I wondered about that too, because you hear about you hear middle-aged women now. Middle-aged women, they are at their sexual prime. I think personally, though I didn't find anybody who specifically studied, women longitudinally, like tracking them because you'd need to follow a group of women over time and sort of, see how they've changed from their 20s to their 40s. But I think what's going on a lot of the time is that, by the time you get to your mid-30s or 40s as a woman, you know what you like and you know how to make it happen or ask for it or talk about it. The other thing going on is that you've got your birth control situation under control. You're not anxious about, am I going to get pregnant? So you're just a lot more confident and used to your body and how it works, and you feel more comfortable talking about sex. You've known your partner longer, maybe. There's all kinds of things I think that contribute to a woman feeling more comfortable with sex, more comfortable making it happen the way it works for her, and being relaxed about it, as opposed to somebody who's sort of just stepping out into the world of sex. I don't know hormonally why that would be the case. I think your hormones, you tend to have a decline in middle age in libido and hormonal. So I don't know I don't know why physically a woman in middle age would have a better sex life than in her 20s. There was a study that Masters and Johnson did in the 70s that doesn't get a lot of publicity. Everybody's familiar with their big project on human sexual response in the 50s. People know that they did that. But they did this interesting study where they looked at gay and straight couples, some actually not just short term, but they paired them up. So it was people having sex for the first time, and then there was long-term committed partners, both gay and straight. And they looked at this was the only study I came across that was really a qualitative look at sex, like who's having better sex and why. And in fact, the best sex was being had by long-term committed homosexual partners. Two things going on. One was that there's something called gender empathy, which is if you have the same equipment, you kind of know intuitively what feels good. And in the 70s, this was done in the 70s, and the heterosexual couples were tending to do things to their partner that they would want done to themselves, which didn't always play well. And there was also sort of a mechanical element of like, well, if I twiddle this for about 10 minutes, that should be good for her, and they weren't really getting into the moment, and they weren't really sort of watching their partner and sort of they weren't losing themselves in the experience and being turned on by their partner's response. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in good, really great sex that it makes it very different from efficient sex. And so the straight partners, and this was the 70s, I think things have come a ways since then. But the hetero partners tended to be a little more mechanical and a little more just like, well, yes, we've both had an orgasm, so that was good sex. Whereas the long-term partners were, particularly the gay ones, but also among the straight partners, they were you know, that's where you found the really amazing, where somebody would sort of, you know, draw it out and be aware of exactly what stage their partner was at in their arousal and that kind of thing. But to answer your question, yes, that's the only study that I came across that actually did draw that conclusion. I think that the women's magazines and a lot of those quick tips for better sex, I think that they do people a disservice sometimes because they become very focused on they're thinking, oh, okay, I read that I should do this, and am I doing it right? There's a certain amount of anxiety that comes from thinking, I don't know if I'm supposed to do it this way, and I don't know if he's responding, and I don't know if am I doing this right? And rather than just being more led by just letting it go where it takes you and losing yourself in it, instead of you know, trying this sort of menu of things you read in a women's magazine. And there's a certain amount of pressure, I think, also among very young girls to do what's expected of them, and you know, I don't know what they're getting out of. You know, I just don't think that that's the way to have good sex. So, but that's not in terms of practical how-to. You know, there's the one study I found that was the one sexual therapy technique that seemed to be that worked well for women and seemed to be pretty simple was like mindfulness training. It's just all about not spectatoring, not watching yourself, just being in the moment and not being anxious about what's expected of you, or are you reacting right, or is your partner reacting right? But that's, you know, easier said than done. You know, it's like somebody telling you, relax. You know, you relax if you're relaxed. People have actually looked at the whole issue of use it or lose it in a way, meaning that if you don't have a partner and you're not having sex, there's research to suggest that it becomes harder and harder. This is in women. I don't know if it's ever hard for men to have an orgasm, but for women, there's some data to suggest that the more frequently you have arousal and orgasm, the easier it is to achieve. And that if you don't for years and years, first of all, you get some atrophy going on, particularly in your later years. So there is, masturbation is actually it's kind of a, I don't know the word I want for it. But anyway, masturbation is a useful strategy for somebody who seems to be having trouble getting aroused and having orgasm. So, you know, yeah, but you know, who's going to fund that study? You know, I asked somebody because I asked. There's these people there's a product called the Eros clitoral therapy device, and it's essentially a suction vibrator that costs $400. And I said, well, why don't you just use your finger? Why? I mean, if the idea is that to bring more blood to the genitals, why do you need this $400 device? What masturbation will bring blood to the genitals? That's what happens when you're aroused. And I said, well, you know, has anybody ever done a study like looking at how beneficial it is for women with sexual arousal disorder to regularly masturbate? And this woman said, you know, are you nuts? Look what happened to Jocelyn Elder. We couldn't possibly try to get funded. And then she had this great line. She said, masturbation is a very touchy subject. Freud was, well, in terms of female sexuality, Freud was not the lady's friend, because Freud's view was that that the clitoris was focusing on the clitoris was a childish thing, and that was like for women who had not been fully feminized. That once you became fully feminized and a fully realized woman, that the pleasure would transfer to the vagina. Which is no help to anybody. So I don't think I heard anybody refer to Freud. I stumbled onto Freud when I was looking into Marie Bonaparte, because she actually, ironically, went on to become a Freudian therapist and had to renounce everything that she'd said about the importance of the clitoris. She did a complete about face. But other than that whole chapter, nobody even mentioned Freud. You know, nobody mentioned Freud. But again, Freud was all about the id and the ego, and not so much about the genitalia specifically.